Welcome to This Week in Hearing, where listeners get the latest information on all things happening in the hearing care space, from device technology to practice management, to pharmaceuticals to regulatory actions. My name is Amyn Amlani, and I have the privilege of serving as your host. The ability to provide services to patients across state lines, either in person or through remote care, and without having to obtain additional licenses, is becoming a reality through an occupational licensure compact. To discuss this issue with me today are Susan Adams, Director of ASHA State Legislative and Regulatory Affairs, and Tracey Ambrose, an audiologist at Children's National, a hospital located in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Well, let's start with a little of an introduction, if you don't mind, and I'll start by looking on my screen here. We'll move left to right. So Tracey, if you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience a little bit about yourself, please.
Sure, absolutely. So I became an audiologist. I graduated in 2008. I did my extern or my fellowship year at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. And then I started my career at the Children's Hospital right there in LeBon, our Children's Hospital in Memphis. And I was there for about 7 years. And then I came to Children's National in DC, and I've been here as a lead audiologist for, again, about 6-7 years now.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful. And Susan, what about you? A little bit about yourself, please.
So as you mentioned, I work at ASHA. I'm the Director of State Legislative and Regulatory Affairs. And that basically means I review all of the legislation and regulations that come out that affect audiologists and speech language pathologists. I'm a lawyer by training, but am more interested in the kind of behind the scenes of creating legislation and getting legislation passed.
Well, and I tell you right now, we're in one of those periods where this legislation component seems to be happening quite a bit, which is exciting, but our viewers may not be up to snuff on something. So today, we're going to talk about this thing called an Interstate Compact. What is that?
So in the most simple terms, an interstate compact is just a contract between two states to act in a certain way. It has the force of a statutory law, and it allows the states to work together to fix a problem or recognize a standard or cooperate in a public policy area. I think the most popular interstate compact that you've probably never heard of is the driver's license compact. So you have a driver's license from your home state and you can drive anywhere in any other state. And that's because all of those states have agreed to let you do so.
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. So this compact now is permeating into healthcare in some form or fashion. And we'll get into audiology and speech pathology here in just a moment. But my understanding is it already exists in some of the other occupations. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, we are the seventh interstate compact in the healthcare field to come out. There are 9 now, so there's 2 more that have come ahead of us. So there's medicine, nursing, EMS, psychology, physical therapy, advanced practice nursing, occupational therapy, counselors, and then our compact for audiologists and speech language pathologists.
Wow. There's quite a bit, and it's exciting. So for the audience, what are some of these advantages of this interstate compact?
I think for our compact in general, the advantage is simply access to care. You know, getting audiologists and speech language pathologists access to those underserved populations, geographically isolated populations, and then also allowing our military and military spouses to better keep up with their practice as they're moving every 2 to 3 years.
Well, let me ask you this as I'm thinking about it. Did COVID have a role in maybe accelerating this process to any degree?
I think maybe a little bit. A lot of states during COVID allowed for a lot of telehealth waivers, making it easier for people to practice across state lines. And the Interstate Compact is just a way to formalize that relationship that we've already been kind of marching toward.
Wow, okay. So how are these things developed? I understand that there's a relationship between these 2 states, but what actually goes into this handshake between these 2 different regional areas? I mean, how does that work?
Usually takes a couple of years to get to that point. The CSG, the Council of State Governments, has a National Center for Interstate Compacts, and they've worked with most of the compacts that are currently out there. And they had this 3-phase approach to creating a compact. So phase 1 would be developmental phase. So you would conclude a advisory group of stakeholders to come together to say, is a compact right for us? What would we want it to look like? What do we think it should have in it? they would come up with a set of recommendations that they would then hand off to a drafting team. And the drafting team would take those recommendations and kind of put it in a formalized legal document. Once that's done, the stakeholders would look at it and make any comments to it. Once the advisory group would sign off on the compact, it would kind of go to the enactment phase or the education phase. So we would educate legislators and regulators about what the compact does and how it does it. And we would get states to pass the legislation to enact the compact. Once you hit your threshold of states, you would move into phase 3, which is the transition and operation. So you would transition from individual states to a compact commission overseeing the compact, and all of those individual member states coming together as a compact commission to make decisions on rules and bylaws, the database, how the compact would work from day to day. And then during this time, you're still kind of going through the enactment phase where you want more states to join. Our compact had a threshold of 10 states. So once we hit 10 states, we could kind of transition to that last phase. We currently have 15 states that have adopted the compact at this point.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. So let's now dive into the Interstate Compact as it relates to audiology and speech language pathology. So where are we at? I know you mentioned that we're up to 15 states. Where are we at in what's next for us? And then how is this going to work, so to speak?
Well, our next phase is that initial compact commission meeting. And we're scheduling that right now. We're hoping that's going to happen in this winter. So we'll have 15 states attend to that meeting. There will be 2 members from each state, one addressing the audiologist and one addressing the speech language pathologist. So they'll come together and take this framework of this legislation that's been passed and say, okay, how do we operationalize this now? How do we implement it? So that's the phase that we're in now.
So I know ASHA's carried the grunt of the work for this. Are there any other professional organizations that are behind the scenes that are collaborating on this agenda?
Yeah, we've been working with the National Council of State Boards of Examiners in speech language pathology and audiology. They're a group of licensing represented. We've also been working with the Academy of Doctors of Audiology and the American Academy of Audiology behind the scenes as stakeholders to make sure that we're including everybody in this process and being as transparent as we can.
And then as you alluded to earlier, there's it takes a little bit of time before this thing actually kicks in. I think I read somewhere we're looking at 22 or 23 before it's enacted and we can expect the privileges to be issued. Did I read that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Like I said, right now we're waiting to have that first commission meeting. When the commission meets, they're going to have to implement bylaws for the commission, how the commission itself will act, and then rules to implement the legislation that they've passed. Once they do all of that, then we have to create a database and get all of the states to be able to talk back and forth between their licensing systems and the Compact Commission. Once that happens, that's when we can start actually implementing the Compact and issuing privileges to practice.
Sounds like a lot more work to be done, and we're very, very grateful for everything that you've done, because I think this is going to really be a huge game changer in how we access or how consumers access us and how we're able to provide some services for them. So let's get into the requirements and the role of the audiologist. I mean, how does this compact affect how the audiologist is going to perform his or her duties?
From the audiologist standpoint, it wouldn't change how we perform our daily activities with our patients. It wouldn't change how we treat our patients. Just to give you kind of a little idea from where I'm coming from. So in DC, obviously we're in a small area where we're touching a bunch of different states. And so we have offices in Maryland and Virginia as well. So each one of our audiologists has to have licenses in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And so, and in Virginia, we have to have 2 licenses because they actually have a separate hearing aid dealer or dispensing license. So each one of our audiologists has to have 4 licenses before they can start practicing. And so if I, as a manager, if someone, resigns or we have a new position opened, I have this huge gap in time where I'm trying to fill that position and have this person get 4 licenses before they can start. So it really just becomes for us a barrier to care, because we don't have that provider to be able to see the patients. But as far as we're seeing the patients and how we're delivering our care, there's no difference to me if I'm licensed, if my home state is Maryland or if I'm licensed in DC, and how I'm actually practicing and providing that care to the patient.
So let me ask you this, because I worked in industry for a while, and when COVID hit, we were looking at some remote care opportunities through some screeners and what have you. And we ran into a little bit of issue because of differences in state licensure allowing for certain tests to be performed. So I'll give you an example. State A said that in order for you to consider this a diagnostic test, you had to have this, this, and this. And state B would be a little bit different, where you had to have a room and some other things. Does the compact equalize those differences in the state's regulatory differences, or does it equalize them so that you can get a license in one state and it permeates across all the other states without having or looking at these differences that may exist in their statutory requirements? It's a loaded question, sorry.
I think for the states, you always have to follow the law of the state where your client is located. So even through the compact, if your home state allows you to do one thing, but your remote state doesn't allow you to do that, then you would not be able to do that in the remote state. So you would still have to follow the scope of practice in the state where your client is located.
So that brings up an interesting point. And I'm going back to your database comment, because I'm not sure if this will be a part of that. How does the provider then know that I'm in my home state and these are the remote states that are participating as part of this compact? These guys are restrictive in doing this, and I'm able to do it in my state. How is that going to be available to the provider, or is he or she going to have to do their own home?
I think we'll be able to provide some of that information generally through the database, through the website. We'll provide some of that information, but it really is, the onus is on the practitioner to know the laws of the state where they're practicing, which is how it is currently.
Tracy, do you run into any of those issues where you've got these differences in state licensure across the three states that you talked about? Do you run into any issues and differences? And how do you manage those?
Honestly, we really don't. We're pretty standard through Maryland, DC, and Virginia in the services that we're able to provide and that we're able to bill for. So we don't have, we certainly, and when you test in each state has a separate little test or exam that you have to take. And sometimes when you renew your licensure in that state, you need to kind of take an updated little exam just on specific different regulations that they may have. But as far as the services that we're able to provide, we're pretty equalized across the board for at least Maryland, DC, and Virginia.
Okay. So let me ask another question here, because I'm sure this will pop into the minds of the license holders. What about continuing education? Is that going to be a part of this compact? Is that something that's going to have to be considered so that we're equalizing what those might be as we look at these different states, or is each state going to be different, just like the licensure laws might be?
I think that's one of the benefits of the compact, and one of the things that we really tried to focus on to make sure that we can make things as easy as possible. So the compact is based on your home state license, and that means you just have to meet the requirements of your home state license to get a privilege to practice in another state. That privilege is going to renew at the same time as your home state license, and you won't have to meet any additional continuing education requirements for the remote states. You would just focus on maintaining your home state license, doing your continuing education for your home state license. The only caveat is if a remote state has a particular piece of continuing education that they require you to do, you might have to do that. So if your home state doesn't say that you have to do anything specific about, say, cerumen management, but your remote state says you need to have one continuing education credit in cerumen management every renewal period, then you would just have to make sure that you do have that one continuing education credit. Otherwise, it's all based on your home state license.
That's interesting. Can the remote state revoke your privileges for them? So they still stay a part of the compact, but can they say, hey, we're not sure we want you practicing in our state? Is that a situation that has occurred or that could occur?
I think the only way that you'd be able to revoke somebody's privilege to practice is on the basis of disciplinary action. I don't know that any compact out there, any healthcare compact out there that can arbitrarily revoke a privilege to practice. It would have to be it would have to be based on some disciplinary action.
Let me also ask this. How will this impact students who are in various graduate training programs? Is that going to affect them in terms of the apprentice licensures that they get as they're being educated, and then as you supervise those students across these different states?
So the license is based on your home state license. So, and it's based on a full license.
Okay.
So you have to be a fully licensed audiologist to access the Interstate Compact.
Okay. Okay.
And if I can speak a little bit to that too, I think, we always take students at Children's National. We have multiple at the same time. And what we're looking at is more of the governing bodies to make sure that the students fulfill all the requirements. So we're really looking more towards ASHA, because I can't anticipate if my student is going to, move to California and start practicing there. So we're going to look more towards the governing bodies of the entire, field or practice, like ASHA, to give us more of those regulations for the students to make sure they have everything they need.
That's an interesting point. Thank you. So consumers, the reason for these protections is to, for the safety of the consumer at the end of the day. Let's talk a little bit about that. How do these compacts not only impact the provider, how is it going to be a safeguard for these consumers?
I think for the compact, it really extends the reach of consumer protection. Right now, a state can only take away that which it has given. So if it has given you a license, it can take away that license. But if you move to another state, it has no reach for you. When you're in the compact, if you have your home state license and you have privileges to practice in other states, if you've done something in another state, some disciplinary action in another state, your home state license can decide to investigate that too, because you're part of this compact. And the privilege to practice really is a privilege. If you lose your home state license, you lose all of your privileges to practice. So it benefits audiologists and speech language pathologists to follow all of the rules and protect the consumers. It gives the state licensing boards a lot more reach if they need it to get those bad actors.
So let's talk about, kind of as we come to the end of this, what is, other than the accessibility of the audiologist to reach more patients, are there any other advantages to this that you all can see, either from a practice standpoint or from a legislative standpoint, that we haven't talked about yet?
I think we covered a lot of them. I think the biggest for audiologists and for providers is that access to care, honestly, from my standpoint, because we want to make it uniformly available, and on the provider side, the expense is going to be less for getting, we wouldn't have to have 3 licenses for Maryland, DC, and Virginia. That's to start off, you're looking at $850. There we would, to become a provider, you wouldn't have to put that expense out at first. So from the provider side, that would certainly be a nice little benefit, that it would be a little bit less costly to enter into the field. But yeah, I think mostly looking from the patient standpoint is that really access to care that we've discussed.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's really the access to care, facilitating that continuity of care if people are moving around. We saw a lot of that during COVID. And then, like we just discussed, a higher degree of consumer protection.
Let me ask this, as this just popped into my head. Does the compact have anything to do with assistance in those states that allow those? So in other words, is it going to be able to make the model maybe a little more efficient, where the assistant can do some of the things that he or she is able to do given the governing body that oversees them, that then will allow the audiologist to see another patient? So we're seeing more patients through this accessibility model that's absolutely wonderful and being created.
So the compact does not apply to assistants. And the reason that is because there's no uniformity in licensure for it.
Yeah.
So we can't create the standard. We can only take what's already there and make it more equal. And that's what we've done with the audiologists and speech language pathologists, because every state requires the same basic things for a license. But again, with assistants, some states don't license them at all. Some of them license them at a high school level or an associate's level or a bachelor's level. So there's just no uniformity there for us to work with.
Yeah. So as we wrap up here, going to go to final thoughts here. Any final thoughts that you all would love to share or can share with the audience as they're starting to embrace this, become educated about it, and hopefully utilize this in the future?
I mean, for us, we're just excited that we're finally to this point. Started this project in 2017. We're up to 15 states passing it now. We're really looking forward to 2022, where we can introduce it in even more states. And I would just urge anybody who's interested in the compact, you can go to the compact website, which is aslpcompact.com, and you can reach out to us through that website if you want to send an email, if you're interested in learning more, or anything like that.
Tracey, any final words for your fellow practitioners?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo kind of what Susan said. We're really excited that this is kind of taking off a little bit more. And I think that as we spoke about in the beginning, COVID has kind of highlighted some of the benefit of the telehealth and being able to have more of a far reach for our patients and to make it a little bit easier for our patients to access care, both audiologists and speech language pathologists. So, I think we're really excited as well that this is moving forward and to have this opportunity.
Well, I really appreciate all the insights that you all have shared. It's educational for me, and I'm sure it'll be educational for our viewers. And I know that this is a fluid development. It's going to continue to hopefully grow as we go from 15 states to 25 and eventually to all 50, plus the District of Columbia that will participate in this at some point. And we'll hopefully be in touch later down the road, and maybe we can get some updates as things go on. But really appreciate your time. We'll make sure that the website is embedded inside of the video here so those individuals can access that information online. And thank you so much for your participation and, again, wealth of knowledge that you shared with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.